Hello and welcome. My name is Tracy Reinhold. I am the Chief Security Officer for Everbridge. And today we're going to have what I like to consider a thought leadership session around the trends in security during the pandemic and what's happened or what we anticipate to happen post-pandemic as we begin to emerge. So we're very fortunate today to have a great panel. I will ask each of them to introduce themselves to you so that you'll know who we're speaking with, and then we will get right into the meat of the issues. So Julia, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. And my name is Julia Finke, and I'm currently the Regional Security Officer for Asia Pacific and the Middle East at Volkswagen Group. In that role, I'm responsible for all relevant security topics in 19 countries and for almost 100 business units. In general, like as a former police officer, I actually have a very traditional career track that I followed, having worked within the police in different fields of responsibility, including foreign assignments for the European Union in Afghanistan and Libya. Before I then in 2015 actually dipped into the corporate security world, initially becoming Chief Security Officer of Media Markt and Saturn, and then finally joining Volkswagen Group in 2019. And, you know, apart from my operational background, I also have an academic one, because as a criminologist, I have experience and education in police science, criminal justice, and governance.
Great, thank you very much. Lana?
I almost am ashamed now after this wonderful background to say something about myself. Thank you, Tracy, for inviting me. Hello to everybody, wherever you are. I have a privilege to be here in what seems to be the female-dominated, one and only female-dominated panel in security, so thanks for that. My name is Lana Jürgen-König, and I'm greeting everybody out of Germany. Actually, I'm sitting in Cologne. I am a security risk management leader for EY GSA, EY being the biggest, one of the big four, the biggest professional services firm, and GSA being a region in EY covering Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Liechtenstein. I'm responsible together with my team for all security relevant topics internally. This means we are not client facing, we cover security internally, everything that happens in the physical world, excluding cyber. And I've joined EY 3.5 years ago. I came from Deutsche Post DHL Group, headquarters, corporate security, where I was building and coordinating Global Security Situation Center, which is a strategic intelligence cell for DHL Group, which is the largest logistic company in the world. And prior to that, I was many years in Ministry of Defense on various topics on national and international security, also deployed in Afghanistan 2010. Let's say this was a peak of my governmental career. My background is not coming from security. My academic background is with law, then political sciences and business administration.
Great, thank you. Letitia?
Hi, yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invite. I'm Letitia Remiana. I'm currently the Global Security Capability Manager at Unilever and the UK Chapter Chair for ACES. I'm based in the UK. I've operated in the security profession now for around 15 plus years. Starting in my security roles at Lloyds Banking Group, and then moved into Amazon and Tesla. My background is very much in business. I started off in the bank and worked my way through the banking roles, and very heavy in customer service, but also had a very strong lean into the security elements within every role that I'd done up to that point. And I was very fortunate to get a role looking after all the head offices for Lloyds Banking Group, and that was my introduction to security.
Excellent. And Petri?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Petteri Rantaren. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Nokia Group, and in charge of all of the security domains, so meaning physical, cyber, products, services, and of course people. And I've been with Nokia for a long time, more than 20 years, believe it or not, and done all kinds of security related roles in Europe, but also in Asia Pacific. And at the moment, I'm based in the headquarters here in Helsinki, Finland, and it looks fairly nice, sunny outside. I do have a master's in security and risk management, but I've also done some degrees in marketing, and that's where my kind of academic background comes from. That's it. Thank you.
So as you can see, we have representatives from various sectors of either manufacturing, consulting, some former bankers. So it's a bit of a disparate group. And I wanted to open the session by talking about some of the unique challenges that the pandemic has presented to security professionals across the globe. Interestingly, I think you will find a lot of similarities, but with some nuanced differences related to each individual company. So if you don't mind, Letitia, maybe we could start with you to talk about probably your most significant challenge once the pandemic manifested and how you've been able to work through those in your role at Unilever.
Yeah, so I think I was very fortunate that we saw, because we have operations in China, we saw this emerging at the back end of 2019. And so very quickly was trying to understand this. And again, many of us will have already had our contingency plans from previous potential pandemic situations around swine flu, bird flu, SARS, Ebola. And so we felt quietly confident that we'd done our thinking and everything was okay. I think where this really lent the challenge, particularly, was that it was truly global and that it started spreading. And initially the challenges were the different cultural approaches to what this was and how they were managing those from a governmental perspective, and the communications that were sometimes not in line with what we had assessed the situations to be. So we had this media element where our colleagues in the countries were hearing one thing and we were maybe saying what we believe was more correct. We had a global medical team. That global medical team was working directly with WHO, and so we were getting the accurate information. It was just interesting how the different governments and the media agencies were portraying that slightly differently. I suppose the next major shift then was our different types of operations. So we have large manufacturing, and with that goes obviously all the supply chain. We have the corporate head offices where people could start working remotely. We have R&D facilities that still needed to continue their core work for the business as well. So we had to segment our business and tier our protocols according to the types of activities that were being undertaken, what were critical and what were non-critical. Once we'd understood those, we set out some tier criteria so that we could work through how and what our triggers would be in order to scale up if we started seeing the pandemic take more of a hold in countries, because it was a wave across the globe. We also made sure where we anticipated maybe that medical attention and everything was going to be less, we had made sure we had appropriate plans in place for that. So I think the biggest challenge globally was the comms, the accuracy of the comms and the alignment of the comms and the global IMTs being set up, which I think originally was anticipated to be done at a market level as opposed to a global level. And that was the big difference, I think, for us from our IMT and our pre-prepared planning around pandemics. I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept because, and I'd like to contrast that with Lana, because from a consulting perspective, your employees actually are hosted by your client companies when they travel. So that creates some unique challenges, both from an internal perspective and then how you coordinate with external clients where your own employees would be nested. So I'm curious to see how you handled that.
And thanks, Tracy, for segue to me. It's been a very interesting journey, and I'd like to stay within my region, you know, explaining how we did it. And I think we were quite fortunate because we had intelligence function, threat and risk monitoring function that obviously noticed what's happening at the end of December 2019. End of January, we already had a crisis team that was anticipating events, and we started pulling back people very early. So of course we had expats in Asia Pacific. We communicated with them. It was not ordered to come back. It was at the beginning left on their own decision, but explaining what's going to happen. But nevertheless, we managed, before it really hit any kind of travel disruption, we managed to get all people out of the region back, more or less, safe. Our particular challenge for my region that I cover, is obviously that I'm covering the region that was one of the first hit in Europe. Actually, Austria is where the super spreading events were happening. Italy is the border with Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. So we were quite fortunate, or unfortunate. We were fortunate that we were prepared already, but we were unfortunate because we were the second company in Germany to have infection on the premises. And that was very challenging because obviously nobody really knew how to cope with this, because there was no precedent. There was just one company before. The government was not giving you guidelines. You didn't really know what to do about the virus, what should you shut down for the next 2 weeks, send everybody home, disinfect, and so on and so forth. There was no guidance. It was just this virus that all of a sudden you have so publicly on your premises. And this is where, we launched this crisis response 1 month in front, so we were quite prepared. But when the incident happens and you are one of the first companies to experience this without a real guidance, then it just becomes a really huge thing to cope with. And I think it was such a trust issue, because if we wouldn't have coped with this in the manner how we did, putting people's health first, accounting for all the travelers, accounting for all the clients, for all the employees, and so forth, I think we would have lost out of security and this task force, crisis management task force, we would have lost this trust in a second. In that night, it would have been shattered. And this was a great journey. But I have to say, afterwards, it became easier and easier because you are in tune into the crisis mode. You simply know you have to work those 16, 18 hours per day every weekend, close the office, open the office, and so forth. So the challenges were the same as with everybody else. What's really good with EY is that we are a sort of remote working company. So for us, the disruption was really minimal, because we also saw that we will have the need for more remote working population. We were also, from a technology side, prepared. We are always working somewhere outside of the office. Our office occupancy is actually low. So we have all the policies, confidentiality policies, InfoSec policies, and so forth, so on and so forth. So the impact was not so bad. What I would say is challenging, that was 2020. What I believe is a specific challenge that I'm facing now, and I would be also very curious to see how my colleagues are thinking about this, is that, when is this crisis over? For me personally, I told my crisis team, crisis is over, long live the crisis. I think this is the challenge, that we understand this is not going to go away anytime soon. So yes, security departments can lead crisis teams for certain periods of time, but if we have prolonged crises, when do we start calling them continuity problems, business continuity, recovery problems? So what I see as a challenge for the post-pandemic or the new normal is that everybody wakes up and smells the coffee. You have to deal with this as much as I have to deal with it. So every function has to deal a little bit with this pandemic. Otherwise, for us, it's unsustainable. And I think this is the problem that we all share across all the boards, that we have to somehow share the responsibility for the new normal.
Well, it's an interesting takeaway. And from a Nokia perspective, Petra, I'm wondering, so Lana brought up the word trust, which is critically important in the security world, but combining that with business continuity as we emerge from the crisis, what do you see from a trust perspective, and how we then layer in business continuity so that organizations are better prepared for the new normal state of crises in the world post-pandemic?
Thanks. I think it's really a good question, and I think a bit difficult to answer in that sense that, I do think that, all of the organizations are putting a lot more focus on the contingency planning. I think that's a no-brainer. We've already seen that. But to what extent the actual planning can then further facilitate, the upcoming pandemics or similar kind of a crisis. Of course, it kind of prepares the mind muscles and getting you ready from a mental perspective and the teams prepared. So I think that there's a big role in all of that. But I do also think that as somebody said, that this needs to go a lot broader than just the security teams. And I think typically, of course, we've been collaborating with the business stakeholders quite a bit on the crisis preparedness, business contingency management. But I think if you look at the future way of working, I think we already very early on in the pandemic, we decided that the crisis response, there's a different team, and then more strategic future way of working, that would be a different team, because the scoping is very different. And if you are trying to put down the fire and at the same time plan for the next 2 years, 3 years, it simply does not work. So I think that that kind of a contingency planning and preparing for the future, I think many companies are doing by default at the moment.
Well, it's interesting. So Julia, you've got a huge manufacturing footprint, but you also have a retail end, right? So all of the car stores around the world. I would imagine that this has been incredibly disruptive for Volkswagen based on number one, manufacturing, but number two, retail sales as well. So how has this impacted from a security perspective, your role in the company in Asia Pacific and anything else that might be relevant during the last, say, unfortunately, it's been a full year?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And naturally, as a world's second largest car manufacturer, we are dependent on our supply chains. They are vivid lines for us. And obviously, we have a lot of experience in bringing cars and car parts in time to the right place. But when Corona really kicked in, it was very disruptive, because due to the Corona requirements and entry bans and whatsoever, our suppliers, which we are really dependent on, had to shut down. That really then had an impact on the overall production. And, it was very, very worrisome at a certain point of time for us. And with that, in terms of security, came along the topic of cargo crime. I mean, in pre-Corona times, we were dealing with the topic of cargo crime immensely, but due to the fact that when Corona kicked in, goods and supplies had to be stored interimly at shipyards or warehouses or whatsoever, the kind of targets shifted, because before the Corona it was mainly trucks, and now it shifted to warehouses and shipyards. So we needed to adapt like countermeasures in order to really deal with those organized crime groups that took advantage of the Corona crisis, basically. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I worked cargo crime in the early 90s, just to show you how old I really am. And it was a big deal then. And it was way before we were able to track things electronically the way we can today. So I think a lot of those skills have gone by the wayside. As we have emerged more and more into the digital world, we sometimes forget that the base level at which some criminal organizations operate presents new challenges for the workforce. So I want to shift just a little bit and talk about a potential upside of the pandemic, if I'm allowed to say that. And that is, what does the future workforce of the security field look like? Julia, I know that we had talked about this a little bit before, but I'm curious on your take about what it looks like, where we get our workers, and what we can expect in the future from a global security workforce.
Well, I think in terms of remote and new work environments, I think we cannot put the genie back into the bottle, and we just have to, adapt to those kind of work environments. Within the Corona crisis, we had to adapt to that, not even boosting our IT infrastructure, but also, providing the environment for the people that work from home. And for Volkswagen, it was quite new, because we used to be quite conservative when it comes to that, especially referring to our group security function. But, I think that it's a big chance and a lot of benefits that come along with the remote workforce. because obviously it's being flexible as a company is not only competitive, but it also generates benefits for the company as such in terms of overhead expenses and so on. And I don't think that remote workforces are kind of a showstopper. It's the opposite actually, because I think even the new millennial generations, they kind of require flexible work environments, and we trying to adapt to that. And I think that creating remote workforces and opening up these kind of flexible work environments creates an even larger pool of talents that we might take into the company, as well as, you know, in terms of not being location dependent, it's also a benefit for the companies that you can reduce office spaces and locations. And so all up, I would think that this is a huge benefit for the employees and also for the companies in the future.
Interesting. So Letitia, how do we work with recruiting and HR to rebrand, if you will, the security function so that we attract the right kind of workforce, not only on-prem, but also from a remote perspective? I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Sure. I was just listening to Julia there and I was thinking, you know, there's some upsides and there's some downsides to whichever route we take. There's always night and day, right? So my brain originally, because Unilever is so proud of how it works with the communities and it's all about sustainability and equity. And I was thinking, well, do you know what? For the business, if we employ more electronic measures so that we can account for more remote working and be better at digitization, this is great for the business. But actually in those communities where we are major employers of man guarding and security officers, and those teams have seen the benefits of what remote technology offers, where are we going to lose that skill set as well? And how could we shape our HR functions to look at profiles of people and profiles of roles in order to help them move them into gaps in the business where those skill sets could really add value? So we're not losing men and women who are already part of our wider teams, but reskilling them and upskilling them into areas where their profile, because of their critical thinking skills, their ability to follow direction and orders and have a security mindset, where could we put those people in and repurpose and also make a succession plan from these things as well? And I think that has to start with ourselves as leaders and managers in the security space and being open-minded to there is a potential here for losing people, but where will the gaps be created and could we recycle in a way? And then there's also changing the mindset and the fixed views that some people will have about what security should look and feel like as well. And that goes down to HR and recruitment teams to explain now that security is not guards and guns, it's a value, it's a service that can be added as long as we have the right approaches to our people and our processes.
Well, it's interesting. You hit on a couple of topics that are near and dear to me, one of which is promoting people from the security team into the core business, because it provides great ambassadors for security in the business. And the other thing is transitioning from a cost center to a value center from a security perspective and how we do that. And so, Lana, your team's already dispersed. So you are very familiar with attracting workers in a remote environment from a security perspective. Your team, I know, is across multiple countries. So, and most of them are remote. How has that impacted your ability to recruit for the roles that you have on your team?
So let me give you a surprising information. And even though my team doesn't have a corporate security background, none of them, imagine that, totally different set of skills coming from the business. So knowing the business, being quite a long time in the business, having totally different perspective, but having intrinsic motivation to work in security. How nice is this? That this is the purpose. If we can open our minds and understand that serving military and police doesn't give you a green card to work in security, actually there is no automation to work in this business function, you would open your eyes and see how much of the human resource potential lies around you in your companies or in your environments where people are applying. I think that I don't have problems working as a remote leader because I'm used to do that. I think it's it would have to be a switch in the mind of baby boomers, primarily, the post-baby boomers being us. We are more easygoing, I would say, around this. It would have to be a switch in the mind that you don't necessarily have to be sitting every day together next to each other 8 or 10 hours per day in order to do security. You can absolutely do this remote as long as you keep the social cohesion of the team while meeting from time to time. I think Corona, and I guess I'm speaking for all these teams here, Corona brought a chance for all security teams to glow, to shine, to show what we are capable of. It made the profession very attractive, if I may say. And whilst recruiting recently, I have to say that there is really a scarcity of professionals in the market. So we would have to have different strategies for recruiting because there are not so many professionals, especially those who are willing now to move and change companies. So we will have to apply other recruiting strategies. Think about business acumen, think about technology. And, you know, I know security, but I'm ashamed to say, I have no clue how to program the goddamn thing. So I need somebody in my team who would be a data cruncher who can translate all of the thoughts that I'm having in my head into something that it looks visually and statistically amazing. So that's what we need. We need a good combination of the old guards, being us, now the post-baby boomers, knowing what we are doing, and then the great combination of inspiring young people that can teach us actually something. That's a winner.
So Peter, you had talked about your marketing background, and I think that's a nice transition from what Lana talked about leveraging people without a security background and bringing that diversity into the team as we move forward into the future. I'm curious on your thoughts from Nokia's perspective on how that would work in your team.
I think, yes, it would work. It depends a bit on the security domain that you would talk about, and, you know, whether it's perhaps a junior role or then more senior role. But I think the business acumen that, you know, Lana was telling, I think that's something that, you know, typically the business people coming from a business side, they do have it immediately. They don't have to learn about it. They are ready to go, and then they would need to just get the basics in security. But I do think that there are some security domains like, you know, cyber and things like being a security architect or security engineer, where you really need to have a very robust, strong technical background in order to do the job. And I think it's extremely difficult to learn that, you know, just by jumping in and coming from a business side. But I think then there are roles like analyst and, you know, general manager type of roles where I do think that, you know, the business leaders, they have the insight, they do have the capability and experience to shine in those kinds of roles. So we've been fairly balanced on having people that are purely technical and non-technical coming from a security background, whether that's law enforcement, whether that's then the IT, R&D or something similar, and then more from a general management type of a business capabilities and roles.
You know,
may I add shortly?
Yes.
You know, I'm a police officer, former police officer myself. And, you know, when I entered the corporate world, I thought, I mean, we as police or military intelligence communities could rule the world in the corporate world. But that just didn't happen because we need to adapt to a really new environment. And, you know, I made the experience, and we are trying to set up our team accordingly, that these kind of skill sets that need to be adjusted to new threat environments, which are hybrid or even invisible. And I think that requires new approaches and new perspectives that need to be brought into the team. And, you know, with all due respect to military, police, and intelligence, I think we need to open up even more in the future to get this holistic approach when it comes to security.
Yeah, and I think it's really critical that, you know, we actually pay a lot of focus on this. What does digitalization mean for the security industry? I think I cannot stress that enough. And I think, yes, there will be a lot of good roles for, let's call it like traditional physical or facility related security roles. Those continue to be very, very important. But I think at the same time, I do think that, bulk of the roles, the new roles that we are seeing being developed, they will be more and more geared towards digital and cyber. That's simply a fact.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Julia, to your point, I mean, one of the toughest transitions is either from the military or the law enforcement arena into the private sector. And one of the challenges that a lot of us have faced is, I was a senior executive in the FBI, and it was about mission. And you transition into a corporate security role, which is a supporting function for another core mission. So there's a mental adjustment that has to go on when you make that transition. But we have a question from one of our listeners. Now I sound like I'm a talk radio guy, sorry. And it's something that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon on a cyber panel that I'm sitting on. And that is, the question is, do you feel that the onset of working from home or agile working is increasing the risk of insider threat? So I'm curious, I have my own thoughts, but I will hold those because I'm curious what you guys feel from that perspective as we look at insider threat to proprietary information and that sort of thing. So I will open it up, and if not, I will pick somebody. So yes, Lana.
I'll be happy to. I've been actually thinking about this for very many years, and I think it's not necessarily, and with all due respect to the cyber CSO here amongst us, it's not necessarily to protect digital data and to deploy DLP technology to monitor what's happening with your data. I think insider threat is a must. It has been a must, but now in the new remote working world, it's even more a must. And why? It's the human impact of the remote work. It's the loss of social cohesion. It's the loss of loyalty or inability to develop loyalty towards a company that recruited you remotely and you never saw your bosses or your team colleagues or what the company stands for. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's inability to understand how disgruntled is your colleague because simply they will not show this on a video call. And then coupled together with the layoffs and restructuring that's happening, I think it presents this a super potent environment where the insider threat has it easy. They have it easy because we still did not adapt. We still, I mean, especially you sitting in States, you have more open hands towards deploying various technologies like us in GDPR environment, European environment, and especially German environment, where you have even on top workers' councils. It's very, very difficult. So I think to answer the question, insider threat is a must, but this insider threat program that goes beyond technology and incorporates all the red flag indicators.
Yeah, great. Letitia, I see you shaking your head, so.
Yeah, well, I'm nodding in agreement because obviously the remote, Lana's done a great job there explaining that remote piece and why it's more than just the digital piece and the laptop and the wider part of that goes with how do you actually identify that, if we're handing out an asset, a laptop, let's say as an example, and it gets delivered to someone's home location, are we sure we're handing over the asset to the actual person who's intended to receive it? There's all this detail with the insider threat on that side of the fence. What I find interesting also is hearing anecdotally the stories of insider threat changing somewhat because we've got less footfall on our sites. So the opportunity is actually greater as well, and people's worry and concern about the situation, their jobs. It is creating a little bit more of a physical insider threat issue, for theft of asset or product or whatever it might be, and then that collusion. So it's making sure that we, with a lower footfall, because we haven't necessarily utilized our digital capabilities with our CCTV, and they're not quite humanized yet to spot unusual behavior maybe. we're losing our eyes and ears because of the lack of footfall. So it's back to security basics 101, checking your waste, checking who's coming into your site, really validating everything that's being done, that it's happening on its process path. So for me, it's what we're pushing at the moment, a lot of what we call fantastic fundamentals, the brilliant basics, you know, getting them right and sticking to them because they're important.
Mm-hmm. In traditional insider threat programs, there are triggers that indicate an individual. So, for example, working at off hours, coming into the office in the middle of the night, accessing your computer. Well, all of that goes out the window because there is no set office hours anymore. And social engineering becomes more of a challenge for remote workers because they are isolated and they feel that they're either unappreciated or unnoticed, which, to Lana's point, actually creates an environment which breeds insider threat for those that are disillusioned. The problem now is that we don't see the telltale signs that we used to see when we were in a confined work environment. So somebody actually has asked you, Lana, on the chat, exactly how you would address this from home, from a remote perspective. And I think that Letitia did a good job of talking about the brilliant basics. I love that. I'm going to steal that, by the way. And how we, so to the entire panel, how do you combat that in a remote environment? What are the indicators of insider threat that you would look for in your role? So I will open that up to anyone who wants to respond to that.
I'll jump in again very quickly. I'm trying now to work in partnership with our cyber and data teams on combined programs now. Historically, we've done it siloed because we want to tackle the detail in each of the domains. I think one of the quickest, the most agile ways of tackling the broad basics again is doing it in a combined effort. So that's what I'm tackling at the moment. And I'll stop there because I'm sure everybody's got ways that they're tackling it in their organizations.
Yeah, so before you jump in, one of the ways is actually through non-security metrics. So for example, we have virtual happy hours at work where employees get to interact with each other. So it goes back to the question of brand loyalty and association with the company. So it's not a security function per se, but it's about making sure that they identify culturally with the company so that there's that tie, even though they're not there physically. So I'm curious about other thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Tracy, that's a very good point. And I think it's really a wider people-related issue or human resource-related issue. And I think we are actually looking at that from a multiple different perspectives. And I think at the end of the day, I think line managers, they really need to be engaging with their employees a lot more than in the past, because that office environment, for the time being, it's gone. And if you are not engaging people that are across the world or in a different sites, that's going to be causing a lot of problems. But I think on top of that, I think then having the capability for informal coffee chats, personal support services type of programs, all of these are actually kind of giving the company and of course the security managers further insight how our people are feeling. And as long as the line managers are doing regular dialogue with an employee, I think that should be the best indicator when things start to go wrong. And then providing the line managers tools and processes to flag that up. How do I actually flag that up if I notice that this person is not feeling good? So it's about well-being, it's about mental health, and how do we as a company, how do we as a line managers, how do we support that?
Well, go ahead.
No, I just want to add, if you think about Edward Snowden, and I know I'm throwing in now a name, it was over the years, it was kind of a perfect development in his life that could have been tracked, and everybody would have then understand what's about to happen. The movies are saying, but how does this line manager, who is not having a security background, feels or has a feeling for what's about to happen, to forecast that that person is going to go rogue. I think that's very difficult for them. And this is where we have to step in with awareness and trainings for those line managers, because we wouldn't notice an insider. And also for some of them, we wouldn't even care, right? It's about the amount of damage that the insider can do. So obviously we have to go back to the org charts and understand what is the amount of damage that that person can do. And then how do we, you know, how do we empower the line manager with certain, however you want it, red flag indicators or certain trainings where he understands, okay, that person, something's happening and that person is, I wouldn't say dangerous, I would say valuable.
And I think it's a good point that, of course, Edward Snowden was a bit different kind of a case example. I don't think that, you know, the line manager could have picked him out from the, you know, has anything suspicious or anything like that. But I think typically if people are struggling from a mental health perspective, you know, your co-workers or your line manager typically tends to see something, but I think in quite many cases they are afraid to take that up, either with the individuals or with the HR. I think, you know, there always will be exceptions like Edward Snowden, who actually do think that, you know, their ideology is so strong that they truly believe that that's the right thing, you know, either for the company or for the wider society, why something needs to be done. And those will be very difficult, obviously, to detect and prevent.
So,
and I think it's always about like being sensitive for early warning signals. And this is not only the responsibility of security, basically. And what we did, we kind of composed the task force out of group security and our health department, HR, and psychologists, so that we actually implemented the metrics that we work in with to detect those early warning signals. And I think that's elemental to get this topic on track actually in the future.
So it's an interesting concept, and I want to sort of segue into one other thing, and that is we've talked about the challenges associated with insider threat of remote workers. Let's shift just a little bit and talk about what the expectation is from a duty of care perspective when employees are no longer congregated in a single location. Both from the employer's perspective and from the employee's perspective about what that looks. And of course, that's influenced culturally around the world with expectations from the different cultures that we all operate in. But it is definitely something that is front of mind as we emerge from the pandemic, is how does this change our duty of care responsibilities as we move into what the new normal will look like. And so, Julie, if you don't mind, we'll stay with you to kick this one off.
Yeah, I mean, coming along with the remote environment of the workforces, there are legal implications, like legal and moral implications for each and every organization. And I think when it comes to duty of care, I mean, we need to do our fair share. And it's possible to do risk assessments in their home environments, but if the lines start to blur even more and your working environment is not home, but a beach resort in Mexico or Thailand, where you work from, then it's becoming a different story. And that's a huge challenge that will be awaiting us in the future. And I don't think we are prepared yet for those kind of scenarios. So, you know, dealing with the regular duty of care is no problem at all. But if it expands to scenarios I just mentioned, I think that'll be a huge challenge for each and every organization.
I have a fairly simplistic view on this topic, and I think, of course, there may be different countries who are interpreting things differently, and that obviously that is fine. But I think our duty of care is actually pretty much the same. It doesn't matter, you know, if an employee works in the office, you know, full-time, or whether he would be full-time home-based employee. The company still have a lot of accountability and duty of care. Just the location does not take that away. It's simply one factor in the duty of care chain.
I would agree, our systems account for people's location. I think it's the detail surrounding it that maybe makes us nervous. So the systems are already in place, I would agree with Petteri, but I think it's the detail that we've never done before. And I think my personal opinion, because I like to understand what I'm controlling and how best it can be controlled. I think it's just working through those scenarios to find that level of comfort. And if I'm not comfortable, flagging it and just checking, are there any extra steps we just need to put in? But I do believe the systems we've got for duty of care are already correct and in place. It's just now the different detail that needs to be addressed.
If I may, I'm quite opinionated here. and that probably comes from coming from a conservative work environment into this remote working, modern working environment, where even before pandemic, EY was new ways of working and new work implemented inside. So I kind of saw this coming. I do believe that we have to fundamentally change how we do security in the new remote working environment, because the duty of care, in my eyes, changes from being reactive to being proactive. Why I'm saying being reactive. So up until now, we were doing security like this. There was a terrorist attack or any kind of incident. We would take a look at the geolocation of the incident. Then we would take a look at how far is this from the office, or perhaps transportation hub, because we might have some travelers. And if this would have been out of office hours, 100 kilometers from the office in a residential area, we would not necessarily have processes to manage this. We would consider this insignificant. But today, this is exactly where you could have a person sitting and working for you, right? So, and I'm talking from a European, aka German perspective. In the GDPR environment, there's not so much you can do about this, because you cannot really tell your employee, listen, every day in the morning when you wake up, brush your teeth, geotag yourself, please. Whether you are at the office, whether you are at a client, whether you are at your boyfriend or on the beach and so on and so forth, they will not do it. We will not ask. But the duty of care stays. But what changes is that, you know, we have to empower our employees with policies, processes, technologies, and our visibility to help them manage any kind of security relevant incidents. And they have to discharge their part of duty of care as well. So if you find yourself in an incident, and I have offered to you all this plethora of solutions how to help you go out through this incident and give you real-time incident awareness and real-time incident support, and you still decide not to use this, then we cannot be held liable for breach of duty of care. But if we wouldn't have set up all these solutions, then I think we would be going beyond what's expected in the new working world.
So in interesting concepts, let's shift once again to talk about so we tend to focus now on what the new remote workforce is going to look like, but there's still going to be a ton of people that come back to the office, right? Especially like in a manufacturing environment like Volkswagen. There will be thousands of people that return to work at a corporate headquarters, regardless of those that choose to stay remote. So let's talk a little bit about the security challenges as we return to work en masse. What does that mean? I mean, how are we addressing this? Is it security's responsibility when it comes to, are we preparing to provide PPE for employees? If we are, how's that being distributed? And are we responsible for contact tracing if we have someone who tests positive back in the environment? And what does that mean from a security perspective? So I'm curious on your thoughts about that, because not only do we have to manage the remote workforce, we also have to manage the workforce that's not remote. And how do we address those challenges? So it has become a little more complicated, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are as we begin to welcome employees back to the offices. So
Can I start?
Yes.
I mean, okay. I mean, you hit a very good point, Tracy, because as we are a car manufacturer, we obviously have a lot of people coming on site. And that was even a huge problem when, you know, we had to shut down in March and April production, and time was coming up to kind of resume production. We really had to deal with implementing safety and security measures for almost 50,000 people in one plant. Yeah, so that was a huge effort. And what we did, we implemented like 100 points plan, implying 100 preventative measures, starting from establishing employee hotlines to refurbishing the offices, identifying green, yellow, and red workplaces. So it was a huge effort that was behind the concept. And obviously, we as a security function, including the plant security, we had a big stake in that. Obviously combined with our health department, but we constantly since then have been involved in really securing those kind of measures that we initially established back then in March last year.
Interesting. So one of the things it's been a sort of a global trend pre-pandemic was the new open workspace, right? No more offices, everybody. So now we're seeing the opposite happen, where we're actually creating segregated spaces from a health and safety perspective. So that means more costs to reconfigure yet again. So Letitia, from Unilever's perspective, how are you guys dealing with return to office?
So I guess we might have been in quite a fortunate position because Unilever was deemed to be a critical supplier for hand washing, bleach, everything. So we had to stay operational throughout this whole pandemic. We couldn't just switch off and have a look at everything and then come up with some plans. We literally were working through the plans. So all that contact tracing, everything that you mentioned, and we saw what was working, what wasn't working. So when we talk about this easement and people wanting to come back to the office, and obviously dedicated working spaces with your 2 meters or whatever around you, as opposed to the open collab space, which actually I think is what people have been missing. So where people have wanted a desk and for whatever reasons, there's a whole myriad of reasons people would like to be permanently back at work or in a workplace. We can accommodate those people, but we've seen that traditionally, it's a 50-50 balance. There's loads of people who want to just remain working from home. There's a handful of people who want to go back full time, and there's a break in the middle. But the people in the middle, it's the collaboration that they're missing. It's not a dedicated workspace, and it's not this balance of home life. So we're looking now at how do we accommodate the middle group predominantly. And so therefore, with regards to that easement, all those calculations, all those plannings are going into how to operate the space. And I'm very involved at the moment with that future of the office, future of the workplace. And we're looking at nothing new here, but smart building. How do we do these smart building technologies now with sensors, with the digital, if you want a collab space, how do you book that? So pre-booking. These are all things that we did through Microsoft Teams and shift management capabilities within MS Teams that allowed us to do that for some of our facilities so that we could desk plan. We could make sure the office was separated. So we would have floors that would be separated and bookable. And then we had the concept of, well, how do we get people? Because if the public transport isn't really very managed, we don't want them putting people in these positions where they're going to be really protected in the workspace, but not in their commute. So there was a lot of work in certain countries and environments about that transportation element as well, and how to protect from pickup to delivery, if you like, and that transition between the transport, the home, and into the office. So there was a lot going on. I think we've been very fortunate, and we've been learning this entire time. And our easement plans, as I alluded to earlier, are on a tiered basis, depending on vaccines now coming into it, but again, on case levels and everything like that. And we've got triggers that allow our businesses to operate between our tiers and set protocols within each of those tiers.
Interesting. Petri?
I don't think that I have much of a concerns from security or safety perspective. I think we do have a good plans and solutions in place for those. I think what is a bit more complex is that, how do we actually attract people back to the office? That is really difficult scenario. And I think I read some studies that, 60%, 65% would actually like to permanently continue working from home or working remotely. And I think in some roles, obviously, that is fine, but I think it does not apply to all companies and all industries. So for me, it is for the security and safety teams and a wide number of teams. How do we convince people? How do we communicate and how do we make the workplace something that is clearly adding value moving forward. So I think that's going to be tricky. I'm not concerned about the safety and security controls. I'm sure that they will be spot on, but it's the mindset and how do we change that.
So it's really what you're talking about. Really is about how do we message this, right? Yeah. So it's almost a marketing PR process to get people so that they, in their heads, they feel that it's safe to come back to work. And that they want to. So the other challenge that we're facing, and it's not necessarily a security challenge, but if you're in London or New York, you've now garnered another 2 to 3 hours a day that you're not commuting. So if you live outside the city center and you work in the city center, it's very counterproductive. Some companies have actually seen an increase in production based on the lack of commute. Mostly, and tech companies in particular are very agile in this respect because they do that. But then it brings up the whole process again about insider threat and cyber risk associated with remote working. One of the challenges, and I'm curious to see if any of you have this, some companies are allowing employees to use their own devices for company work, which is creating risk because the patches aren't being pushed, the updates aren't being installed, which leads to additional vulnerabilities. And a lot of this is actually something as simple as a smartphone. If you're using a smartphone to do your work, and it's a personally owned smartphone, how does that impact your security posture related to threats, either cyber or insider?
Yeah, of course, I think, if you don't manage it well and if you give that kind of an access without no controls, yeah, it's not a good recipe for success. I think it's going to be a nightmare. But I think with the multiple different mobile device management programs that there are existing, I think that is something, many companies are able to address really proactively. And I think things what you pointed out, like patching and the updates, you don't simply have access if the device is not up to date or if the device is not trusted. Or then on top of that, you may have additional controls for those devices that are, like as an example, not company provided devices. Mm-hmm. So I think that there are a lot of different means to mitigate against that very valid concern, what you pointed out, but it requires good thinking from the IT and security teams.
Right, so IT hygiene. Go ahead, Lana.
But the other dimension is, even if you don't have a BYOD policy, you would still have all these applications that are employees downloading on business phones. And that's not normally regulated by policies, because policies don't regulate individual applications. So you would have something like a Clubhouse downloaded on your business phone, and then presenting a vulnerability that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily clear to anybody what kind of vulnerability it would present in the future, but people are doing this. And as well with Zoom last year and with WhatsApp 2-3 years ago, it will emerge and develop. But I think that even if you don't have bring your own device threat, still you have, the possibility to have a lot of threats downloaded via the App Store.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree to some extent, but I think, if you look at like iOS as an example, I think the way they isolate and sandbox different applications, I think it's a lot better than any of the laptops or desktops that we are using today. So by far, it's a lot more secure than any of the laptops and desktops that we typically are using. So I think, yes, I do get the concern, but I think it's also that, again, it's about the controls what we are putting in place.
Well, unfortunately, I think we could probably go on for a couple more hours, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. And I want to take an opportunity to thank each of you for sharing your insights and experience with the audience that we've had today. And I will tell you that there have been a ton of questions that have come in, and we've tried to address as many of them as we can during the course of this presentation. But I would argue that we are all remote, yet somehow we have all connected. And so I think that the sharing of knowledge that we do at sessions like this is incredibly valuable. I come away from each one of these better informed than when I started, and I wanted to thank each of you for making me a better security leader based on your experiences and your insights. So with that, we will close this session. I want to thank you and I hope that the rest of your day is as good as this session has been. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for having us. Bye.
Thank you. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.